Hello friends, welcome to Kranthi Physics Tutorials. So today we have to discuss about the topic that is types of friction. So first of all, what is the friction? What is the friction? So what is the friction? So friction is the one of the types of forces. Okay, so if any two bodies are in contact with each other, if any two bodies are in contact with each other, then in between the contacting surfaces, so frictional force will be developed. So whenever two bodies are in contact with each other, so in between the contacting surfaces some force is developed. That force is called as frictional force here. So generally frictional force generally so frictional force is always developed in opposite direction of the applied force. Frictional force is always in opposite to the applied force. Frictional force is in always opposite to the applied force. So here for example, so a body of mass m, is there. So that is lying on the surface. So lying on another surface. Now if we can apply some force F, on this body, so then the body is moving in this direction. But so in between the contacting surfaces of this body and this surface, in between the contacting surfaces, the frictional force is developed in the opposite direction of the applied force. So the frictional force is always in opposite to the applied force. Okay, so now let me see how many types of frictional forces are there. So this is the types of frictions. Okay, so now how many types of frictions are there? So generally we have three types of friction forces are there. So the first one is the static friction. So static friction can be denoted by the letter F suffix S. Okay, so second one is the kinetic friction. So kinetic friction can be denoted by the letter F suffix K, F subscript K. Okay, so the third one is the rolling friction. Rolling friction. So rolling friction can be denoted by the letter FR. So generally we have three types of frictional forces are there. So first one is the static friction, second one is the kinetic friction, third one is the rolling friction. So static friction, so when the static friction is developed, so whenever the body is at stationary position, so whenever the body is at rest position, so then only the static friction will be developed. So the static friction will be developed so whenever the body is at rest position or the body is at stationary position. So for example, if a car or if a bike is there, so if that bike or car is at rest position on the surface of the road, then so in between the surfaces of the tires and the road, the static friction will be developed. Here static means stationary. So that's why whenever if any body is in a rest position, then only the static friction or stationary friction will be developed. So this is about static friction, and static friction is denoted by the letter Fs. So here Fs is directly proportional to the normal reaction force. So the generally the frictional force is always directly proportional to the normal reaction force. So what is the normal reaction force? So for example, if a body is if a body of mass m is lying on the surface, then the body acts the total weight, the body acts the total force or the total weight in the downward direction. So the lower surface is applies north equal and opposite normal reaction force onto the upper body. So here if two bodies are there, so one body is lying on the another body, so then the upper body always acts its total force in the downward direction. So the lower body, so it is always acts equal and opposite normal reaction force onto the upper body in the opposite direction. So this is the normal reaction force. So here n equal to mg. So that is called normal reaction force. So here the frictional force is always directly proportional to normal reaction force, and the frictional force is equal to mu n. Here mu is called as the proportionality constant, and it is called as the coefficient of friction. So mu is called as the coefficient of friction. Here mu is the proportionality constant and we called it as coefficient of friction. So here also the Fs is directly proportional to n, and Fs equal to mu Sn. So where mu S is called as the coefficient of static friction, so static friction, coefficient of static friction. So therefore Fs equal to mu S, coefficient of static friction, into normal reaction force. So this is the one of the most important relation. So here when the maximum value of the static friction, is called as the limiting friction. So Fs value, if it is maximum, then it is called as the limiting. So limiting friction, it is called as the limiting friction, and it is denoted by the letter F suffix L. So the maximum value of static friction is called as the limiting friction. So now once the body comes to motion, so whenever the body is in motion, then kinetic friction will be developed between the body and the lower surface. So whenever, if any body it is in motion with some velocity, so then which friction will be developed? Kinetic friction will be developed. So kinetic friction is also called as the dynamic friction. Kinetic friction is also called as the dynamic friction. So if your body is at rest position, then which type of friction will be developed? Static friction. If your body is in motion, then while it is in motion, then only the kinetic friction will be developed. Here the kinetic friction is also equal to mu Kn. The kinetic friction is Fk equal to mu Kn. So mu K is the coefficient of kinetic friction. Here mu K is called as the coefficient of kinetic friction. Okay. Here the third one is the rolling friction. So whenever the body, if any body is in rotational motion, then in between the, if any body is in rotational motion, then in between the contacting surfaces, so rolling friction will be developed. So for a rolling body, so rotatory body, for a rotatory body or a rolling body, so whenever the body is in rolling, not sliding, so static friction is developed when the body is at rest position. Here the kinetic friction is developed for a sliding body, but here the rolling friction is developed so when the body is in rotating motion. rotating motion. So here also we can write Fr equal to mu r into n. So when this is called the coefficient of rolling friction, coefficient of rolling. So coefficient of static friction, coefficient of kinetic friction, coefficient of rolling friction. So finally, static friction is developed when the body is at rest position. Kinetic friction is developed when the body is in sliding motion. Rolling friction is developed when the body is in rotatory motion. So here, so three types of frictions are there. So here the maximum value of static friction is called as the limiting friction, and here you remember kinetic friction is also called as the dynamic friction. So among all these three frictions, you must and should remember, so Fs is greater than Fk is greater than Fr. So among all these three frictions, you must and should remember Fs is greater than, Fk is greater than Fr. So that means rolling friction is very less and static friction is very high, more. Okay, so you must and should remember. So in all these three frictions, rolling friction is very less, really very less. Okay, so this is about types of frictions. Okay.